All right, the recording is underway, and Ruth, take it away. I think you're going to kick us
Great,
off.
thank you, Krister, and welcome everybody to our latest in a series of conversations about the science and art of great teams and the 6 conditions for team effectiveness. What we're going to be doing today in this conversation is taking a look. Well, I'll first introduce myself, and we'll introduce the faculty who are hosting this webinar and tell you a little bit about our work and our backgrounds. But then we want to do a little collective reflection about the best and worst teams in all of our experiences and what contributed and got in the way of the effectiveness of teams, to begin building some common ground for how we think about team effectiveness, and also to harvest some of the lessons of your observations and experience about what really contributes to and what really gets in the way of a collaboration becoming a really brilliant one. Then I'll take us through the 6 conditions for team effectiveness, the overall model that's come from our many years of research on teams. My colleague Richard Hackman at Harvard and many of us have been working on this question of what are the handful of most powerful influences on team effectiveness, and we'll share that framework and how we've summarized that research. And then we'll spend a little time, Krista and I and Georgina, talking about how those of us who support teams or work in teams or lead teams can use the 6 conditions for team effectiveness in the way that we go about supporting teams. There are a variety of different ways of doing that. Gudrun, you mentioned earlier the team diagnostic survey. That's one way of doing it, but there are lots of different ways that we incorporated into our practice, and we'll have a chance to hear from many of you about how you do that as well. And then the bulk of the conversation we wanted to have on a new substantive subject is about team authority structures. We've been seeing that the authority structure of a team, how much power a leader versus the team as a whole holds and what they have authority over, has really important implications for how we support them and how we work with them. And we wanted to explore that issue from the perspective of coaching teams, of training team coaches, and some of the systematic things that we've seen from our research and practice on authority structures. And then the last thing we will introduce you to is some other opportunities and ways that you can go deeper with the 6 conditions framework if you're curious about exploring this framework further in the work that you do with teams. So that's the coverage of the grounds of our conversation today. Just to reiterate Krister's invitation, please, by all means, raise questions and thoughts and reflections as you go in the chat. One or another of us will always be monitoring it, and we love to incorporate your voices into the conversation. So we'll continue to do that throughout. So here is your faculty team for for today. I am Ruth Wagaman, and I've spent most of my 30 years of professional life being an academic in the field of organizational behavior and studying the most powerful influences on team effectiveness. So really started by studying teams whose performances matter in real time. So customer service teams and performing ensembles and flight crews and teams of chefs, and really wanting to understand how you could set teams up like that in advance so that when performance really mattered, they could collaborate brilliantly. For the last probably dozen years or so, my work has really concentrated on the special challenges of leadership teams. So teams that individually have leadership jobs, but also are collectively responsible for the leadership of a larger enterprise. And with my colleague Richard Hackman at Harvard and some of our colleagues from Hay Group at the time, we wrote the book Senior Leadership Teams, What It Takes to Make Them Great, which really is another way of exploring the 6 conditions framework and seeing what we've learned about the particular challenges of leadership teams. I'm really delighted to have Krista and Georgina joining this conversation today. I think all of us share a passion for really spreading great collaboration in the world, that we all believe the really big and important problems of our time are only going to be solved by building really great collaborations across boundaries. And all of us devote our time and energy and work in supporting people like you who do the same thing, who are trying to help build really great collaborations when it matters. So I'd like to turn it over to Georgina. Welcome, Georgina. Thanks for being with us today. And to ask Georgina if she would say a few words about herself by way of introduction.
Thank you, Ruth. This is a really special moment for me, to be here with you and with Krista. Um, Before introducing myself, really, I want to say that I just wrote an article for our latest newsletter, in the Executive Coach Studio newsletter, and we did a little bit of a book review on Senior Leadership Teams, your book, Ruth, and it took me back to reading the book, weirdly enough, on the beach of Lake Tahoe. I know it's a strange book to read on a beach, but I was reading it, and I like to read with a highlighter pen, the pen, and in the end there was so much highlighting on the book that there's more highlighter than there is plain text, because it spoke so much to me. So it feels like a real honor to be here with you today. And Krista, I discovered your fabulous work with the Team Coaching Zone that has been such a resource and an inspiration and learning place for me and for many colleagues. So a wonderful work. I've been an executive coach for now, this is my 26th year. And over the last decade, a bit more than a decade, developed a really strong interest in team coaching. And at the time, there weren't many resources out there that I could access about team coaching. There were books about teams and team effectiveness. So I learned by reading as much as I could to inform myself, and through practice, and through a very bumpy road of practice, of some things working, some things not working at all, and reflecting on that and putting it into practice. And these days, as well as my executive and coaching practice, I coach teams, and in the Executive Coach Studio, which I founded a few years ago, we run a certificate and a diploma in team coaching. The main aim of that being to develop great practitioners. So supported by theory, but the interest is having great practitioners. And we talk about the 6 conditions of team throughout the program, and it's a wonderful thing I'm really excited about today. So Krista, great to be here with you today.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of your work.
Well,
how about an introduction from you?
No, back at you, both of you, actually. And so, hi, everyone. Great to be here joining the session today. Krista Lowe, my sort of passion over the last 5 years has been around really this theme of team coaching. So really exploring how do we actually provide ongoing real-time support to teams, and moving a little bit away from great teams as being something we can do in just one-off events, as important and useful they are to, what does it really take in sort of modern organizations to create teams and that really are effective and that we can accelerate their growth and their development and their maturity. So that's been my passion. I've interviewed both Ruth and Georgina on my podcast. Highly recommend you check out those episodes. And I started with a podcast back in January of 2015. And I think I was 30-something episodes in when I interviewed Ruth, and then later Georgina. And, it's led to just some wonderful collaboration. So Ruth and I teamed up about 2 years ago, and to bring this framework out a bit more in a systematic way. And we're really excited about that. I think we've certified more than 430 practitioners so far, and, have attracted great people like Georgina and others now into the faculty to help us with, teaching these courses publicly and inside of organizations. So looking forward to a dynamic conversation today, and maybe that's a good time to move it into the content. Mm-hmm. So Ruth, what do we got on deck for?
We got a question that we would like to invite you to chime in on, which is to reflect on either the best team in your experience. Could be a team you coached, could be a team you were part of, could be in your professional life or your personal life, but either pick the best team that you can think of in your experience and put yourself back into what it was like to be part of that team or to be working with that team. Or put yourself back into the experience of the worst team that you have ever been part of, whether it was trying to support them or whether it was leading them or whether it was being a team member. And we'd like to hear from you, your thoughts about the one thing that you think most contributed to that. So in the case of the best team, what do you think it was about that team that most contributed to that being a really great team experience, and what that experience was like. And the same thing on the flip side, in the worst team of your experience, what was it like to be in that team, and what do you think contributed to that? And invite you to just answer that question, regardless of which kind of team you're thinking about. Just say best team or worst team, and enter that into the chat. We want to see some of the themes that come out of what you're describing in your experiences of best teams and worst teams. And Krista and Georgina, I'll just ask you to help me keep an eye on the chat so that we can pull out everybody's reflections and comments on that.
Looks like we're getting a wave already of best teams. Oh, here comes a worst one. Yeah, I put in both if you want.
I think we find that when people are invited to reflect on one or together, they would much rather relive their best team experiences.
Yeah. Maybe the worst teams are just so traumatic or painful that we want to bury those.
We're getting some really interesting comments here on best teams about clear leadership with vulnerability, honest communication, mutual respect. Best teams, shared passion, shared experiences, wishing to learn together. Best team, very clear goal.
Best team, fully committed, right? So one aspect of the experience is the way that people are working together shows their level of commitment to the team and what exists to accomplish. Energetic, hard-charging leader contributed, but very aware of people and their differences. Oh, nice. Tom saying he was able to be a successful introvert on a team of mostly extroverts. That's, yeah, I mean, that is somebody paying attention to who the people are and how they operate.
Absolutely. We have patience and trust and willingness to grow together.
On the downside, go ahead, Krista.
I was going to say, I think in a lot of the worst teams, one of the things I'm noticing, there's a lot about people and relationships, or there's a lot of relational elements around trust and safety,
political behavior, self-interested behavior, right? Low levels of safety, low levels of communication, no real leadership, unaligned.
Individual egos, yeah, that's a silent mentality.
Talking around the problems and not taking action.
Yeah,
that's one that feels really familiar to me. That some of these things are the reasons we get called in to help a team. That the experiences that the members and the leaders are having around are emerging around the way that they relate to each other in these respects.
I like this example of worst team here: lack of respect, flicking sweet candy paper across a table whilst not listening to a presentation. It's a really great example.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, we wanted to start the session just grounding in your experience, because all of us from childhood throughout adulthood and professional and family and community settings have all been part of teams. So I think it's part of and it's part of our DNA as a social species, right? That we evolved in our millions of years of evolution in small bands of people where leadership tended to be distributed, but it's in our DNA to really work in collaborative groups. And so we want to just acknowledge that and build off of that and start to bring a little bit of how do we bring the science and the art and our experience all together in a dynamic way. So thank you for sharing. There's some great stuff in the chat window there.
Yeah, and an awful lot of it feels familiar. So I'm sorry to say on the downside, that one in particular that you just read, Georgina, how many teams, particularly leadership teams, I see who spend all of their time when they're convened merely presenting information to each other. They're not doing real leadership work. What they're doing is just presentations about what's going on in my area, what I've achieved, and it's actually really deadly for everyone. That much of what's being shared is not relevant for the real leadership work that they need to be doing collectively together.
And when they're just presenting information, they're really working treating their team as a meeting.
Yes.
And sometimes I hear the team referred to as a board, a senior leadership team meeting. There's very little contact or connection between or teamwork.
Right.
Yeah.
So thank you guys for that reflection. I want to
Mm.
see. We'll draw on upon it again as we go through the 6 teams conditions model and framework. But I wanted to talk a little bit about our approach in the research and our approach to what ultimately has become the 6 conditions framework. My colleagues at Harvard, Richard Hackman and I, and many others of his and our students and colleagues around the world, have really been asking the question empirically across all different kinds of teams in many different contexts in organizations. What is the handful of conditions that are actually designable, that you can deliberately put in place, that most powerfully increase the chances that what will emerge over time is a really effective team? And what we have meant by a really effective team are these 3 criteria of team effectiveness. So first and foremost is the team's task performance, meaning every team has clients, every team has stakeholders whose needs they exist to serve. Are they in fact meeting the needs of those stakeholders and providing what it is that the teams need from them? So is the output or the task performance meeting the needs of the team's clients? And then secondly, it's not enough for any team to actually produce a one-off success and burn themselves out in the process. No organization can really afford to have that sort of unsustainable model. We look at a team as effective to the extent that not only does it perform well and meet the needs of its clients, it is also growing in capability over time. We see signs that the way the team is working are making them better and better, smarter, more capable, more agile, in actually getting their work accomplished. And then lastly, a team is effective to the degree that it results in being a place that contributes to the learning, the growth, and the development of the individual members, rather than being a place that undermines or alienates its members. So these 3 criteria of effectiveness are what we have measured in all of our studies over time. And our question has been, what are the handful of things that most increase the chances that you will get this cluster of great stuff that defines team effectiveness? So let me take you to the 3 essential conditions of team effectiveness. These are the fundamental building blocks of a great team. When we think about the 6 conditions, there are really 2 different sets. One is the essentials, and these are things that you must have. They must be in reasonably good shape if you're going to get anything resembling effectiveness out of a team at all. And the enablers, which are the 3 conditions that then accelerate a well-designed performing unit into a really superb team over time. And I just want to underscore that this conditions thinking is about stacking the deck as best you can, and then the processes that emerge as a consequence of those great conditions will be very positive conditions, full of commitment, of really using people's talent, of making really inventive choices about the work. And those dynamics ultimately result in those 3 criteria of team effectiveness. So what are the 3 essentials? They are, first and foremost, if you want to have an effective team, you need to have a real team. Meaning a team that is bounded. It's clear who is and who is not a member of the team. They are stable. They're kept together as a unit for long enough to actually accomplish something meaningful together. And they're genuinely interdependent. They actually need to interact and share resources in order to accomplish a common or shared accountability. And one of the things that I will underscore that we see in our practice in working with teams is that very often what we're asked to do is to improve teamwork in something that is not a real team. Right, so it may be all my direct reports or all the people doing the same job or all the people that belong to a particular department. And the word team is used very loosely. What we mean by a real team is something that is identifiable, bounded, stable, and interdependent for a common purpose. Then the second of the essentials is a compelling team purpose. So a team needs to have a defined purpose that is clear enough that team members could imagine what success would look like, but that is also going to be a stretch of their capabilities to pull off, so it's challenging. And then finally, it's also consequential. It has real and meaningful impact on the life and work of others. Very often we see that purposes can be very clear, so we know what we're supposed to be doing, but maybe not so consequential. what we work on never actually gets used, or the thing that we are doing has no direct or visible impact on the lives and work of others. And then finally, of the essentials is the right people. And we put this one last of the essentials because really the purpose should drive who the people are. And what we mean by the right people are people who have the task capabilities to contribute to that purpose, who are diverse enough in perspectives for it really to make sense for this complex team task to be done by this group of people, and also that the people have the basic teamwork skills, collaboration skills that are necessary when you ask people to work closely together to accomplish a purpose. So that's the three essentials, the fundamental building blocks of a great team. One of the things that we argue is that if you can't get these three essentials basically in good shape, you are better off trying to figure out how to get the work done without trying to create a team, because without the essentials in fundamentally good shape, you will see an acceleration of all of those dysfunctional processes that we find so frustrating in the worst of our team experiences. Once the essentials are in good shape, it makes sense to then consider building the enabling conditions for team effectiveness, and those are these three. First, a sound structure. A well-designed team can then benefit from some basic structures, such as the team tasks are a meaningful expression of the team's purpose. They make sense to be done by a team. They leave the team lots of opportunity to actually use their initiative and judgment. Secondly, that the team is of the right size. It's small enough to actually get something meaningful done together in particular. And finally, norms of conduct. Very powerful influence on team effectiveness over time, that the team develop explicit rules of engagement about what is acceptable behavior and what's not acceptable behavior in the group. So building on a sound structure, also important for us to build a supportive organizational context. So we've seen in particular that certain structures and systems in the larger organizational context can either make teamwork easy and natural and reinforcing, or these systems can place obstacles in the way of good teamwork. So for example, many organizations are designed around individual performance management, individual rewards, where still it actually it puts people in direct competition with each other, that we're asking to collaborate better for the organization to have structures and systems that reward and recognize meaningful team level accomplishment. Or, for example, the information system really needs to provide teams timely data that allow them to know how they're doing, to monitor and manage their work in real time, rather than providing data at a disaggregated or a level of analysis or too infrequently to really support the team and the work it's trying to do together. Also important for the team to have basic material resources and to have available to them training and technical consultation as part of the systemic supports of the organization. And then last of the three enablers is team coaching. And two things to say about team coaching. This is somebody who is paying attention to the process of the team and periodically asking good questions, helping the team reflect on whether there are better ways that they could be working together. You notice that we are agnostic. We are not saying you need a team coach or that it is the team leader who needs to be doing the coaching. Really, what matters is that someone is paying attention to this and that they have some expertise in intervening in the team at good moments and helping the team make the best use of their collective resources in doing the work. We also put it last in chronological order for a reason, which is that we have found in our research that focusing on the process and coaching the team processes in the absence of good fundamentals. We don't know what our purpose is. We don't have the right people around the table. We have no agreements about what good behavior is. You cannot coach a badly designed team to greatness, right? Coaching of that nature around building good work practices is only helpful to teams when the fundamental building blocks are already in place. And we have seen that good team coaching can have a powerful effect on teams that are already in fundamentally good shape around their designs. So that is the 6 conditions for team effectiveness, the 3 essentials and the 3 enablers. The last term that we add to the 6 conditions framework is I place the term team leadership in the middle here because we have a particular view about, therefore, what it means to lead a team. And any act that involves getting the 6 conditions in place and keeping them in place over the life of the team is an act of team leadership. And that might be something that is done by the designated team leader, the person who facilitates the group. It could be acts that are taken by the sponsor who decided that the team needed to exist in the first place. It could be acts of leadership that are taken by team members themselves. But the critical thing is that the full complement of really necessary leadership is getting each of these 6 conditions in place and keeping them in good shape over the life of the group. I just want to share with you some of the references from our research. If you would like to dig more deeply into the 6 conditions model, you can find all of these references on our website, teamdiagnosticsurvey.com. But we're drawing particularly here on the development of the Team Diagnostic Survey, on our work on leadership teams, which is summarized in the book Senior Leadership Teams, on some of Richard's great work with analytic teams in the intelligence community, a really great book for fabulous lessons on leading teams is Richard's 2002 book, Leading Teams, Setting the Stage for Great Performances, and many updates of the themes and practical lessons of that work in his 2011 book on collaborative intelligence. So that's our briefing on the 6 conditions framework. We wanted to now spend some time talking with you about the whole variety of ways that those of us who can support and work with teams can use the 6 conditions framework to enable the effectiveness of any kind of team. So I'm going to just lay out a bunch of the different ways that the 6 conditions framework can be used and invite Krister and Georgina to talk a little bit about how they have seen the 6 conditions framework be useful in their own practice with teams. I'll invite the rest of my faculty team here to chime in as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ruth. A lot of great interaction going on here in the chat window as well. And I was just thinking about some of the questions coming in around, does this model apply to squads and flight crews? And I know in Richard's book, he wrote quite a bit about flight crews and did a lot of extensive study of flight teams, and also just around this idea, what was coming up was McChrystal's book on Team of Teams about, he uses the metaphor of a gardener, of a team leader as a gardener, and I think that's a metaphor that you and Richard often would use as well, about really putting in place an ecosystem, that really gives rise to great collaboration. I think that's what we're talking about here, with the 6 conditions framework, is really about, teams are complex systems, so we don't want to get into very simple cause and effect relationships, but what we can do is put in place an environment that really stacks the deck in favor of a great team emerging. And Richard has a great, you probably could speak to it more eloquently than me, Ruth, around different ways of landing an airplane. And he talks about 2 classic ways you can land an airplane. One is to take over the controls the last 10 minutes and do a lot of, leader-directed flying, adjusting level, speed, all that kind of stuff. But more classically, most planes are putting in place a set of conditions 30 minutes out that the plane almost lands itself, right? And so it's another alternative how we can actually create an environment that leads to the conditions and the probability of the outcome that we're seeking.
It's a great metaphor, and I'm glad you reminded us of it, Krister, because the turn of phrase that Richard uses, that pilots use, is to be established on approach. And that's as a consequence of all the pre-work to get you in good shape as you're coming to this culminating performance. And I think this 6 conditions framework is using the same kind of logic, which is you create the conditions that get a team established on approach. They're on a positive trajectory, and they naturally will be arriving at a good place in the way that they work together and the things that they accomplish.
Yeah, so just to say, we like to say that the 6 conditions framework is the real hero, and it's a way of thinking about team effectiveness that really helps you then to think about where is a team in terms of its design. How does it have in place these 6 conditions? Many teams that we come across are not functioning well, so we get requests to come in and work. And a lot of times what we find, there's a request for a half day, 1 day, maybe if you're lucky now, 2-day type of launch or relaunch with the team. team building type thing. But what we oftentimes find when we run the diagnostic or we just interview the team members or the team leader is that, a lot of what's going on in the team, the lack of trust, the dysfunction, or just the lack of effectiveness is linked back to, these 6 conditions weren't really thoughtfully designed. So a lot of the requests we're seeing are around team formations and launches, and many of them are pre-existing teams. They may not be brand new teams, but teams that have existed are going through maybe a new cycle coming up, annual cycle now, or there's a leader in transition taking over a team. And a lot of that is really about rebooting the team and refocusing it. And we've come to see that as a real discipline that, teams really need to be constantly relaunching given the speed and dependent upon the speed and the environments that they're operating in. So in addition to using the team diagnostic survey, we also use the framework in real time. So sometimes you're with the team and, you can just pull out, we have a paper and pencil version. We'll share an image of what that looks like a little bit later in this webinar. So there's some real-time ways of doing some self-assessment. But, I would just say that, for me as a practitioner trying out lots of different frameworks, the 6 conditions framework has been really helpful for me in introducing to teams a way of thinking about teams, about their design, their launch, and then the ongoing coaching, and in that sequence. And, we'll come back to that a little bit later. We're also, embedding this into leadership development programs, upskilling internal practitioners and team leaders themselves around the framework. So that's a little bit about some of the ways that the framework's being used. But Georgina, what about for you? Because I think you've been embedding it into your team coach training, right? Not as the full model, but as part of the approach of what you're teaching.
Yeah, so I use it in 2 different ways. One way in our team coaching training is really encouraging coaches to think about preparing the ground for team coaching. And I also do quite a lot of team coaching supervision. And I find that many coaches fall into the habit perhaps of going straight in from a proposal to working with a team. And in my view, that's leaving the effectiveness of the team coaching somewhat up to chance, because if you've got a team that's not fit for purpose in its design, it will be really hard to get the team coaching to be effective in terms of increasing their capacity to work together effectively and to collaborate over time. So when I introduce the 6 conditions model to coaches, I'm finding some light bulbs go on. And people go, yeah, okay, I've experienced that problem. For example, of having a team whose job it is, part of their work is to make strategic decisions, and then there's a team convened of 17 people, and they're finding that's not effective. So that's one example. Then in my own practice, increasingly I've taken to using the team diagnostic survey, but reviewing it instead of always reviewing it with the team, reviewing it with the team's leader, as a way of creating an opening for a dialogue about how the leader leads, how the leader thinks about leadership, how the team is set up for success, and getting great feedback of that being really valuable conversation time, really stimulating.
Great. Thanks, Georgina. Just give you guys a little bit of look at some of the other ways that some of the things that we just talked about here. And I want to just start talking about a little bit about the implications that the 6 conditions framework has for working with teams, because I think is going to be an important teeing off point to our dialogue about authority structures. But just a few summary ideas here. Richard Heckman and I over the years have come to articulate this heuristic. Think of it as a heuristic or a rule of thumb, rather than hard and fast, but a pretty good estimate. And the question is, if you want to intervene in a team in ways that have the most powerful impact on the effectiveness of the team over time, where should you put your attention and emphasis? This is something actually I was just teaching with a cadre of senior leaders yesterday at the Harvard Business School, and where we've come out in our research about this is to say that about 60% of the highest impact things that you can do are actions you take before the team even exists. It's in the pre-work of thinking through, do I even need a team? And if so, what for? What is their unique added value to the overall purpose of this enterprise? who can contribute to that purpose, and how will I articulate it in a way that they will experience as really compelling and as connecting them to the impact that they have? And what sort of resources are they going to need in order to accomplish this work? And what guidance can I provide them, or conversation can I lead that's going to help them establish some healthy norms of conduct? So that's all in the design thinking and the preparation, what we came to call pre-work for teams. The second most powerful thing that you can do, the 30%, is in breathing life into those conditions in the first few minutes in the life of a group. If you work with a lot of teams, you recognize that teams get onto patterns right away. They get into these patterns and rhythms of how they're going to work together, and those can be very lasting. So how do you breathe life into those conditions in a way that really gets them off to a brilliant start? So they're already established on approach, right? They have lift in the work that they're doing. And only 10% is in the hands-on coaching, the day-to-day intervention in the way that the teams are actually working together. And as often I do when I work with leaders, I ask them the question, where are you spending most of your attention? And they acknowledged that the vast majority of their energy is actually going into the ongoing coaching. And one of the perversities of that is, if you haven't done the work around the pre-work and launch, much more stuff is emerging in the process that needs your intervention. And so you get stuck in this loop of having to continuously do ongoing coaching. This is one of my favorite quotations from the late, great Richard Hackman, who said that once the actual work begins, team leaders have relatively little impact on the overall effectiveness of the team. It was really the intelligent preparations that leaders made beforehand. And so fundamentally, the way that we think about using the 6 conditions framework to impact team effectiveness is all of those process things that draw our attention as signs and symptoms that a team is actually off track are not the primary point of intervention. That in fact, where your leverage lies is actually in addressing those conditions, and that's what will elicit really positive processes that ultimately result in team effectiveness. So in the course of the work that we do with teams, this is one just to give you an idea of how we can do some of this work using the framework in real time. I handed out this yesterday to the group and invited them to do a report card on a team that they care about and give a grade to each of the characteristics of a real team and a compelling purpose and the right people. And then to think about strategies that they could use to actually reformulate or relaunch or get their teams in much better shape, both around the essentials and around the enablers. Georgina was talking about the team diagnostic survey. This is just an image from the overview feedback that a team would get on the team diagnostic survey. For those of you who haven't explored it, this is an instrument that does a systematic measure by inviting all team members to respond to a questionnaire and provides feedback on 5-point scales about the team's standing on each of the 6 conditions. And much of our work is about debriefing teams and debriefing leaders and helping them to understand what is getting in the way of their effectiveness and to set some priorities about how to do the work. So let me pause for a minute, Krista, and see if there's anything that you want to add, or Georgina, or anything that might be coming up in the chat.
Just the only thing I would add here is I think, we've sort of, tagged a line around, blending really science and art, but starting with science. And so grounding in data, grounding in some evidence. I think that's oftentimes a good place to begin with many teams, but that it really requires artful intervention then to really do the intervention around how do you intervene around these conditions and bring that to life. So I think, we're really trying to bring what we think is, the best at least in our practice around leveraging science on one hand, but then really bringing it to life with art, because again, teams are complex systems. So, I think we want to avoid just cookie cutter, very simple solutions, but, the framework seems to give us some guardrails around what typically are the things that teams need some focus on. And there's lots of different ways to intervene and bring that to life.
Thanks, Krista. So I just wanted to turn to our sort of new subject for today, which is team and leader authority. The 3 of us have been reflecting a lot on this and how it impacts our work with teams and with team coaches. Lee, you had raised a question earlier about where team accountabilities come from. You could ask the same question around Where does interdependence come from? Where does purpose come from? Where do resources come from? And we find that different kinds of teams and organizations are experiencing different answers to that question. And so I wanted to introduce a way of thinking about team authority structure, and then reflect with Krista and Georgina a little bit about how the idea of authority and how authority structures can affect the way that we go about working with teams, for better or for worse, how it creates tripwires, and some better and worse practices for how to deal with them. So just to introduce you to a little framework about how we think about authority structures is, in every team, somebody has to actually execute the work. Somebody's got to get the work done. And in every team, somebody has to monitor and manage the work processes and say, is this working? Do we need to shift how we're going about it? In every team, somebody actually has to design the team and decide who's going to be in it and garner resources and assign rewards. So that's the design work. And in every team, somebody's got to decide why we need a team in the first place, and what it actually exists to accomplish. And there are different kinds of teams and organizations where it is within the authority of the team to fulfill each of these functions versus in under the authority of managers or leaders. So what we've come to call a leader-led team is a team in which the team really only has the authority to execute the task. And it's really the leader who is directing everything else, deciding why we need a team, designing the team, monitoring and managing the work. Typical examples of a leader-led team would be teams of people who are working in manufacturing on an assembly line, for example. They're all they are being asked to do is execute the work, and all of those other functions are fulfilled by those in authority. A surprising number of leadership teams that I have encountered operate in this model, where the chief executive has all of the authority about all of this, and the team is only executing. In what we call a self-managing team is a team that also then has call it the managerial authority to monitor and manage their own work process, to make choices about the scheduling and timing and deployment of their capabilities in getting the work done. Self-managing teams, and many of you may know that there was a lot of effort and attention and turned up a lot in the research, at least in the mid and late 1980s, about making the transition from leader-led teams to more self-managing teams in organizations. More advanced still are teams that also have the right to design their own team. They can choose their team members, they can garner resources, they can decide how rewards are distributed, and the only thing that is left in the hands of leaders or managerial authority is setting overall direction or deciding why we need a team. And then the team that has the most authority over its functions at all is what we call a self-governing team. This is a team that can decide in the first place to be a team, and what purposes they are actually going to solve together. We found this a helpful rubric for thinking about a lot of the kinds of teams that exist in organizations, but what kind of team you're working with, I think, turns out to have really important implications for how you go about working with teams. So I'd like to invite all of you to reflect on how you see team authority and what a leader has in their hands versus what a team is invited to have authority over. How does that actually shape the way that you work with teams? I'm going to turn to Krista and Georgina to ask them very explicitly to talk a little bit about how they've seen this arise in their own work. The first question being, how do you see differences in authority structures create tripwires in the work that you do with teams? And Georgina, for you, about as someone who develops and trains coaches, how do you see authority structures create tripwires as you're helping people to develop as team coaches?
Well, it was really useful seeing the recap of the model there, Ruth. And one of the things that I see with team coaches, again, it's one of these things that perhaps we haven't thought about or is out of awareness, is that as coaches, have we really unpacked our own beliefs about authority, power, leadership? And without being clear about that, sometimes I find that coaches unwittingly go and impose their own ideals about leadership on a structure that has very different ideals. So, for example, an organization that's made up of leader-led teams, and then coaches who have a strong desire for self-governing decision making and self-governing leadership and consensus decision making. And coaches can get into a real power struggle there, completely unwittingly and out of awareness, with the leader of the team. For example, they're asking, they go into a workshop with a team and ask the whole team, what's the purpose of this team? What's the compelling purpose of this team? And in this particular team, it may be more appropriate to have that conversation with the leader, because it's a leader-led team. So one of the things that's really useful about this model is thinking about what conversations you may have with the team as a whole, and what conversations you may have with the leader. And the authority structure is a great guiding light for that, and helps us orientate ourselves in the team coaching. So Krista, for you as a team coach,
Yeah.
what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, well, there's lots of, I would say, dead bodies in the wake of my early days working with teams, because I would sort of just bypass the authority structure and really just want to get to the team. And so I would oftentimes get out of step with the team leader. And in manager-led teams, that usually turned out to be disastrous, where, you know, the team, us as team facilitators and coaches, and the team were really showing up and really engaged, and the leader was just, somehow was off to the side. And whenever we created moments for the team leaders to step in, they did a good job of sabotaging all the work we had done. And, you know, we would leave saying, boy, that leader was really terrible. But, in looking back on it now, many years later, it's sort of, you know, a lot of it was on us, that we were really not respecting and honoring the structure that was there, wanting something to be different than what it was. And,
Yeah,
you know, I think every team I work with, and it's one of the things I've come to appreciate about this framework, every story of a team is a story about the team as a whole. But more often than not, teams do have a formal leader, and there's a story about the leader's relationship with the team. And so I just have come to really, you know, through practice and working through my own resistance, come to respect that more, and really bring equal weight to that. But, you know, I work with a lot of leadership teams. A lot of them are in the technology space. And so many of them have agile teams working underneath them that are self-managing teams. But ironically, the leadership teams are not working in agile ways, which I find ironic, but maybe not surprising. And, you know, so there's a classic thing that I'm seeing where the leader wants to have a more empowered leadership team that shares responsibility for leading. There's still some recognition of his or her role as ultimately accountable. But the teams are oftentimes acting in ways where their sort of cues are that it's a manager-led team or a leader-led team. And so I think making the authority structure explicit and negotiating around that, helping them develop norms, has been something that I find myself doing with a lot of teams. And, you know, there's sort of different expectations on each side of that equation. And those are usually lying implicit below the surface, and just getting clear about what authority structure would really work best for our team. And it may be developmental, that in the early stages of a team that they actually need more leadership from the leader. But as the team matures, they can start to take on more of some of the shared responsibilities for leading. So I find with the leadership teams that many leaders are very good at going up and down the hierarchy, but they have a hard time influencing across. So, you know, learning how to collaborate across with your colleagues is oftentimes more challenging than when, you know, you have formal authority. The final thing, and this is something I've really learned from you, Ruth, is around the different kinds of motivations leaders have. Some are more grounded in relational motivation, some in achievement motivation, and some in power motivation. And the leaders who are very relational build really strong one-on-one relationships with their direct reports. And that's wonderful, but what it oftentimes does unintentionally is undermines the cross-team collaboration. So the relationships across the members is not so strong. They're very much connected to the team leader. And so that's been an area that I've been really working with a lot of the team leaders around, is how to shift to seeing themselves as team coaches, as team leaders, and to kind of downshift a little bit the focus on leading through one-on-one meetings every week with their direct reports, to really starting to see themselves as somebody who needs to lead a team. And, you know, those are kind of related, but they're separate. So that's just something that I think some of them are having some, we're having some aha moments around that.
Thanks,
and the
Krista.
changing nature of leadership, right?
I'm just gonna back up if I can to the, wait, see if I can get back to the, yeah, here, to this leader-led versus self-managing, which is where you were describing the transition and helping team leaders to see themselves as having a different role when they're asking teams to be self-managing and to, in the words of a lot of leaders, step up, right, and take more responsibility. It shifts both the role of the leader and the team to move from leader-led to self-managing, and that's true at any level of the organization, including those frontline teams that are being transitioned. I found in my early work in the transition to self-managing teams in like manufacturing and customer service settings that a lot of those leaders thought it was all in the coaching, and they were missing their need to revisit the purposes of the team and the composition of the team and the norms of the team and other aspects of the 6 conditions to elicit that monitoring and managing and self-managing kinds of behavior, and then provide the coaching on top of that. And the other tripwire I wanted to raise around levels of team authority that we've seen from the research is, that last bar there, the self-governing team that has the authority to decide that it wants to be a team and to articulate and choose its overall purpose. Those teams really struggle with clarity because creating purpose is not a natural team task. In fact, if you try to work with a team to sort of whiteboard what is our compelling purpose, what you will get is teams that sort of generate very fragmented things, or they sand down all of the sharp edges of clarity. And so working with teams that are genuinely self-governing, which is a lot of my practice these days, you have to create structures that enable them to generate purpose, to use the best of what individuals are capable of, and then find the shared themes in that in order to craft their purpose. So that sort of purpose setting by a self-governing team can also be a pretty significant tripwire that comes up around authority structures. And I just want to say, Andrew, thank you for the resource that you just shared with everybody. Andrew was sharing a resource that helps teams to make explicit what the authority structures are. I think we have found, Andrew, that teams often have trouble talking about their authority structures or being honest about who gets to make what decisions, and having that kind of explicit practice for surfacing those issues, I think, is a really helpful resource. Krista and Georgina, one more question that I wanted to ask to share with the group, which is, what have you come across that are really some reliably good practices that help you deal with authority structures in the way that you work with teams?
Should I pick that up first, Krista? Yeah, so
go for
it. For me, the awareness around the 6 conditions and authority structures. Over the years, I do more and more work before team coaching with a leader, and potentially with the organizational system, wherever possible, to look at how the authority structure operates in practice. And I really liked what you said, Krista, about moving beyond our own ideals that we bring in, and how we'd like it to be, and taking into account how it actually is. And it's fascinating how many times I find leaders haven't given much thought to authority structures. It's almost like an alien concept. There can be a habit formed, maybe handed down from their own previous leader, about how decisions are made, but it's usually rather woolly. And by making that explicit, it really helps the team. It liberates the team to know where they have authority to operate and where they have liberty to operate, and where there needs to be a consultative process. And in my view, it's different to having a RACI, which sometimes I think of a team that's constructed like a spreadsheet. It's more alive than that, as an operating, a way of operating, a way of working. So it can be built into the norms. Yeah. And I think connecting the authority structure into the norms, like Ruth was saying, makes it a really sound practice.
Yeah,
Krista, how about you?
Yeah, the way I've been thinking about this is around what I call sort of like weak or ambiguous situations. So when teams are really not clear about their purpose, their design, their approach, I think what that does is create an environment which really allows for individuals, personalities, authorities to really step into that vacuum and to really dominate. And so I'm kind of interested in thinking about, if we actually create a really well-designed team on the 6 conditions, we get them really flowing as a group. I think what it does is create a strong team context and vehicle within which then authority isn't so primed and maybe can become more distributed, become a little less charged, a little bit more useful, where people can actually exercise authority, the leader, the team members, in constructive ways, and take advantage of the formal leadership as well as the more distributed type of leadership. So I think that's the kind of thing I've been trying to work on with the teams I'm working in, because I don't think authority is something that we resolve, or it's something that's not resolvable, but I think it's something we need to continue to use as an asset and resource and manage it at the different stages of a team's life cycle. So I guess that's how I've come. Again, I came kicking and screaming over many years of just laying waste to some teams. I feel sorry for them. They were my sacrificial teams in terms of my own learning journey, but hopefully I'll pay it back to the teams I'm working with now or in the future. But anyways, that's what's coming up to me when you
I guess we share some similarities, because I ran into similar tripwires. I mean, I've done a lot of my work with senior leadership teams, and I didn't come to that easily, because they have a huge amount of authority, and I want them to be building a spirit of egalitarian democracy, and the authority structures are really very real. But I also have been finding recently in my practice that inter-team relationships are incredibly important, right? So that the team doesn't exist in isolation, but there are other teams that they need to engage with. And I really, I have been doing more and more creating conversations between teams that may have an authority relationship over each other, but the conversation is mutual. It's, what do we need from you in order for us to be effective? What do you need from us in order for you to be effective? And that can help clarify the lines of authority, but also what enables each of these teams to be clear and purposive in the work that they do and their unique role in the organization.
Fantastic. That's another big growth area in my forecast for team coaching would be the inter-team coaching, and a really interesting area for any coaches who are really excited by the idea of working more across the organizational ecosystem. Ruth, before we move on, can I just thank Andrew for another great resource that he's put up onto the chat, which is referred to as the operating model canvas, and Andrew's saying that's helping him have the conversations needed to bring about cross-organizational conversations. So it's a really nice resource there. Thank you again, Andrew.
Excellent, thank you. Is there anything else coming up in the chat, Krista or Georgina, that we should?
Not at the moment. I mean, there's been a nice little exchange going on there, but I'm also just mindful we're coming to the hour, so time flies.
Yes, we are indeed. So please, by all means, we will save the chat that's been going on in this webinar and incorporate it with the resources and share that as well. If these are issues, including the 6 conditions framework, that you have some interest in digging in further and exploring further in your own work, there are lots of different ways to do that. Please visit teamdiagnosticsurvey.com for all of the resources that we shared today. But we also want to extend an invitation to those of you who would like to learn to use the Team Diagnostic Survey in particular in your practice, and also to do a lot of live practice with coaching teams around the 6 conditions. We have a variety of events coming up. The one that we wanted to bring to your attention that is nearest is our Level 2, our Advanced Practitioner Certification Workshop that Georgina and I will be leading in London on the 4th and 5th of April of this year. Please join us and engage with a really great group of practitioners who are working to incorporate the 6 conditions more deeply into their practice, and we will share and do a lot of practicing of intervening in teams in the course of that work together.
And don't be scared by the advanced practitioner title. It's just our second, if you sign up for that, you also will do an online, what we call foundational practitioner certification, which is a way to really learn all the cognitive material you need to know. A lot of themes which are covered today, but
baby.
So that when we get into the 2-day classroom, we're really more hands-on, and it's about bringing it to life through artful.
Yeah, I'm still on the call. I'm still on the call, baby.
Okay. It sounds like
someone is
on the call. Unmuted and chatting with their honey or something. Trying to figure that out and rescue them.
I think it might be JD. You can put JD on mute.
All right, I got it. Yep. Good stuff.
So,
well, it's all about spreading the love here in all forms, right?
Spreading the love.
Yeah.
I want to say, when I went on to the advanced certification program as a learner, what I loved about the advanced certification program is the way that you brought it to life in a practical sense, and I think that's incredibly valuable. So it's not just looking at the team diagnostic survey and the report and what the report means, but we really get into ways of debriefing the report, both with a leader and a team, and practicing with that in reality. So it's for me, it's the most enabling and confidence building assessment tool workshop I've been on, and really encourage people to get on board, because it's also a great way of introducing team coaching to clients. It's a great way of selling in your work by being able to offer some rigor around how you talk about team effectiveness.
I was just going to comment on one of that's great stuff, Georgina, comment on something Ignacio asked there, but just to say, for those of you who need to log out, I know we're a little bit over the hour, feel free to do so, but for those of you that want to stick around and just finish out our conversation, we can stay on for a few more minutes. But Ignacio, thank you for your feedback. I'm glad you enjoyed the webinar. I've had the pleasure of interviewing both Gordon Curfey on my podcast, and a couple of times with Peter Hawkins. I've done a lot of workshops with Peter, and what I would say is, I think both of them cite Ruth and Richard's work in their work. So I think we all sort of are influenced by each other's work. I think Ruth and Richard's tends to be, I think, the most, in my view at least, evidence-based in terms of the underlying original research that I think many others sort of cite and use to support their models and frameworks. So that's all good. So I think that would probably be the differentiator. Is I don't think it's hard to find other team effectiveness models that have really gone through the real rigorous research and subjected their science and research to peer review. So I think you'll find some similar elements. I think Peter Hawkins's framework takes a little bit more of an outside-in approach. So really starts with the context and who are the key stakeholders and what are they needing of the team to step up to as the lens. So I think it's very complementary. I think the 6 conditions framework, we also talk about stakeholders and supportive context for the team, and does the team need to be a real team vis-a-vis what it is that the business demands of it. So I think there's a lot of complementarity. I think what Gordon Curfey's tried to do in the Rocket model, and if you look at the Rocket model, there's a lot of similar elements that I think he was influenced to a great extent by the 6 conditions framework. So so I think a lot of these models and frameworks all have some overlap, and I would just say I think a lot of the original research really came out of Richard and Ruth's work that other people have built on and reformulated in their own approaches. So anyways, that's my reaction.
I agree with you. I actually don't think there are fundamental discrepancies in these models, that all of us have learned a great deal from each other. I will say that I think one thing that we emphasize in our work with the 6 conditions framework is the priority and the sequencing. Right. So essentials really need to come first. If those are not in good shape, those are the thing that most need your attention. That we spend a lot of our energy on teaching what we call structural coaching, which is working with a team and the team leader to build those fundamentals into the team, and only later in the process then beginning to work rather more directly with the process or the dynamics that are going on in the team. So application of that sort of 60-30-10 role to the actual practice of working with teams and leaders. Great. Good. So I just want to say thank you again for all of those who joined in our conversation today. And we are, as we said, we'll be saving the recording and sharing it out with everybody who has registered to participate. So thank you again for being part of a great conversation. Krista, Georgina, anything in closing?
I'm very glad to have been here with you, and it's really fascinating listening. Every time we talk about this, it brings up more ideas for me. And as Krista, you talking about, team coaching you've done where you look back and go, oh, I could have done that differently. I have so many of those examples. So I think for us as coaches, Krista and Ruth, but also for all the people in the call, we're all still learning. We're all developing. We're both have mastery and we're beginners in some way around team coaching. So really, join with us, join Krista's team coaching zone, get in touch with the Executive Coach Studio. Please come on the TDS certification and join a community of us who are really looking to advance team coaching and make team coaching as great as it can be, linking to Ruth's intro, because we believe it's the most important organizational intervention for change on this planet, and it's so needed. So join arms with us, join forces, and let's all create some magic together.
Nice. Love that. Just will echo a lot of what you said there, Georgina, but what really resonated with me is, the learner's mindset, the beginner's mindset that, it seems to be a space that's, you just never really master. And when you think you're kind of getting there, you always find a team that humbles you, or, the organizations are changing in terms of their designs and the demands. So there's always something new. And I think that's what makes this such a rich, exciting space, and at times terrifying when you're, working with teams that, situations you never come across with, but that's, I think, what makes it all interesting. So echo back to you the idea of let's join arms together as a community and really evolve the field. I mean, there's millions and millions and millions of teams out there. So I think there's more than enough opportunity. I think the big challenge is that we actually don't have enough skilled people who really can work with teams at the level of depth that's needed. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing when we're working in-house is the, where the internal practitioners are in their own development around being able to do this work, and the state of team leaders. So I think it's a hugely ripe area. I think the time couldn't be more better than being able to help build this capability now. And I think we actually have a shortage of people in the world that really can do this well. So I think it's on all of us to, really kind of keep pushing the envelope of learning and accelerating our learning, because demand, for sure, it seems to me to be outstripping capacity and supply. Yeah. Cool. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the webinar. So thank you all